this is like probably going to be a recurring thing I do, but I wasn't able to do it last week because it was our first episode. So there are going to, like I mentioned before, there was things I saw in chat last episode that came up, and I didn't quite catch it in the stream, or maybe I did, and I didn't quite process it right. But I processed it a bit now. I've had time to think about it. So there are some things here I want to follow up on because I find it interesting. So last week, for those who were not here, we went extensively over my experiences with ADHD, and you can find that on the VOD channel. I have chapters set up for the VOD version of that stream. Or if you're feeling so inclined, I am going to be releasing that as its own standalone highlight clip within the week, hopefully. I just got to go through it. I just got to go through it properly and edit it down, but it's going to happen. And yeah, so if so feel free to go and see that either after the stream, preferably after. I want there to be viewers here, but long story short, I just went really British for a second. I talked about my experiences with ADHD. I talked about what it's like the mechanics of it, like the neurochemistry a little bit. I gave recommendations for channels that talk about it. And I brought up that this is going to be probably a recurring thing because this is a very fundamental part of my life. And, hey man, that Kodo stream, that is going to happen eventually is, an eventual thing that will happen. That doesn't mean it'll happen soon. Tiamat is indeed British. I'm pretty sure I have a British ancestor somewhere in there. I'm not sure if I have more British in me than Irish. I think I have more Irish in me, to tell you the truth. But I don't know. But yeah, so there was a lot of things that came up in the chat, a lot of questions, a lot of confusions about things. Well, not a lot of confusion, but there's like a few things I want to go into more detail about. And I'm probably going to continue going into more detail because not every description I give is going to be 100% for every person, and I want to just give clarity where I can. I have an Irish in me. Yeah, always. I said that in 2020? Wow, you have a good memory. So, first question, what causes ADHD? Now, this question was not asked directly last stream, I will admit. This is more something I just felt, it should be addressed because it's interesting how people look at disorders like this because with mental health issues, mental health disorders, psychological conditions, they can all be very different and the causes for them can be very different. So, because of that, the origin point for a lot of these conditions are quite distinct. There's, people can conflate one condition with another. It kind of reminds me of when my mum went to the doctor's office because she was sick and she'd been sick for a while. So she went to the doctor and the doctor said, oh yeah, you have a virus. And, she was hoping to get antibiotics. And he was just like, oh, are you sure it's not a bacterial infection? She's like, no, it's definitely a virus. And it's like, are you sure that but maybe the bacteria has turned viral in the meantime? And the doctor just stared at her. And it was just like, that's like saying a cat turned into a dog. Like a bacterium and a virus, they are completely different. The main thing they have in common is they're microscopic. That is their commonality. Otherwise, they're completely different. And in that same way, a lot of mental health disorders, some are related to each other. Like autism and ADHD, they're called cousin disorders. Like they're very, very close. But they're distinct. They're still distinct from each other, so people can have both, like me. But then there are other ones that maybe they'll have similar symptoms to others, but they'll have completely different causal factors, and they'll have completely different treatment requirements. I have BPD because my mother beat the shit out of me. Yep. So BPD is often triggered by there is a genetic factor to BPD, but there needs to be usually a traumatic trigger for that condition to manifest. Yeah, I've done a lot of research into BPD, and I continue to learn about it. I find it fascinating. Along with personality disorders in general have become a little bit of a pet interest of mine over the last year. And it is interesting with BPD because it can manifest early in life, or sometimes they can go through something very traumatic a little bit later, and then it like a switch, it turns on. And it's I think they're almost like two subtypes of BPD. I think there's a few subtypes of BPD. There's actually a few different ways of categorizing it, depending on the book, depending on who you're talking to. It's definitely a disorder that is only just recently become more understood. I think that's the case with a lot of mental health conditions, right? A lot of these conditions have only just now achieved a level of understanding that didn't really exist before. Like, I think it was only in the 1990s that BPD was considered a disorder that was actually treatable. Before that, it was kind of like, oh, we don't even know what to do. And we're kind of learning that about a lot of different disorders that were considered completely untreatable in the past. And now we're realizing, actually, yes, new methods have shown that all humans, they will respond to operant conditioning. It's just a matter of how much effort you need to put into that conditioning and how willing they are to go along with it. There's a whole host of different factors. But it is interesting to think of. 4 subtypes, depends on definition. Exactly, yeah. It's some people break it down, segment it very differently, but it tends to be like about 4 different subtypes. Then there are like different categories on top of that. It's also complex. It's all very, very complex. Which is fascinating. Fascinating. I need to find more synonyms for interesting and fascinating, because I say them a lot. Say them so much. When I was editing, I was just like, stop fucking saying interesting and fascinating all the fucking time. Because it's like, I can't help it. I can't help it, future me. It's I don't cover uninteresting topics on this show. So anyway, what causes ADHD? This is I will put a disclaimer here and say that this is my understanding of it. Intriguing is a good synonym. Engrossing, also a good synonym. Very good. Intriguing, engrossing. I can't wait until we have like augmented reality contact lenses, and then I can just pull up a little thesaurus app on the side, and then anytime I say something, it brings up like a whole list of synonyms for me to say if I feel like I'm saying something too much. That's going to be a good time once we do have actually augmented reality contact lenses, but they're in the prototyping phase. They're only really at tech shows to show that they exist. But the fact that we have them at all shows how far we're coming. So I'm excited. Too bad Google killed it. Oh, they're coming back. They're coming back, Spook. Don't you worry. Google killed it for a tiny bit, but they're coming back. They are coming back. I think it's one of those things where it's going to ebb and flow in development until eventually there's like an accessible consumer version. I mean, how many years did it take us to get like smartphones and tablets and stuff after so many failed attempts with like PDAs and stuff that never really caught on? Like you got to go through all the awkward phases with technology before you reach like the ubiquity of computers, smartphones, all that. Trying to stay 100% up to date 100% of the time, it's difficult even for scientists, because there are so many different papers coming out at so many different times, and it's hard to keep track sometimes, but we try our best here. F? Why are we going F? Are we back? Are we back? There we go. You know, I did see a little spinning wheel there, because I kind of have the stream playing as well for some reason, and I saw the little spinning wheel and I thought, oh, it's just buffering because I'm streaming at the same time. And then I saw the Fs and it was just like, oh fuck, the Fs, oh no. But no, we're good. Just a little hiccup on the way to progress. So as far as I know, and according to my understanding of ADHD, and this actually applies to autism as well, it's all down to genetics. You can't catch ADHD, as far as I know, in the sense that you can't just develop it later in life. Like, maybe you develop a disorder that has similar symptoms, but you're not going to get ADHD, because ADHD, autism, like the reason it's called neurodivergent is because the brain is fundamentally structured differently than a neurotypical person. Like, there are different, like the brain develops in different ways, basically from birth. There are factors that will influence how severe it is, to be sure, but that doesn't change the fact that I think people with ADHD, they have a lower number of dopamine receptors in the brain than a regular person. Prefrontal cortex develops at a slower rate and can often be underdeveloped. And there's just fundamental differences in the structure of the brain, which is why disorders such as ADHD and autism are so complicated to talk about, because they are both disabilities, but they're also kind of, it's weird, right? It's very weird, because I think I have it in my notes here. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. So the best way to think about it is that a person with ADHD or autism will simply be born with a different kind of brain to a neurotypical. And that's why there is, like I said, that's why there's push for neurodiversity and having a more complex view of it, because it's more like you've got a different flavor of brain rather than it necessarily being a straight disability. It's complicated. Like, it's sometimes a disability, sometimes it's a superpower. I think last stream I described it as min-maxing in an RPG. You put all your points into one thing, and you're really good at this from basically the get-go. Like that, like ADHD, autistic people, they tend to be really good at outside the box thinking. They tend to be very creative. But then there's a lot of other stuff that they're just really bad at because they didn't they didn't distribute their points evenly. The brain min-maxed into just a few different areas, and then you know, as you know, in an RPG, you have starting points, and you can get more points over time, to be sure. But the point is, those starting areas, they didn't put any points into them, and it's easier to lose points in those areas you didn't put starting points into as well. It's give and take. It's you know, I love the term twice exceptional because it does describe it so well. You know, exceptionally amazing at certain things, exceptionally not so good at other stuff. And that's why, you know, neuroscientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, it's why they continue to study them and try to learn about them as much as they can, because every disorder is complex, but ADHD and autism, they fall into this really gray area when it comes to how beneficial they are, how debilitating they are, and it varies so much from person to person as well, which is why it's difficult to do studies on them. This is something interesting to note. ADHD and autism, so it's genetic, right? So if we think about how evolution works, something had to be going right with ADHD and autism in order for it to spread across the planet as much as it has. Like, there is autism and ADHD in every country, every community. And, you know, it's not an insignificant amount of the population. It's like 1 in 100 can have ADHD or autism, right? Like, I think that was the statistic I saw. Maybe even 2 maybe it's even 1 in 50. I don't know the exact statistic, but it's not an insignificant number of people. So what does that mean? It means, for better or for worse, something about these conditions had an evolutionary advantage at some point to allow that genetic material to propagate. And to an extent, they still are, they still have traits that are allowing them to be reproductive. There's that allow these things to continue to pass to the next generation. Like, and in very prevalent numbers. These aren't rare. It's not rare to encounter someone with autism or ADHD. In fact, I'm starting to realize it's actually it's becoming fascinatingly common, because the longer time goes on, the more I realize that a lot of people, because, you know, I was diagnosed from a very young age. I was diagnosed at about 5 years old. Started getting assessed at about 3. So I was kind of the outlier when I was younger. But as I got older, more and more people that I knew, that I considered like the normal people, quote unquote, but the normal people I got along with, turns out they got the diagnosis too. And the more I think about it, the more it's like, wow, it's actually, I'm trying to pinpoint people who don't manifest like these neurodivergent symptoms, these neurodivergent traits. It's actually becoming increasingly difficult to do so, which means that there is a lot of, at least in my, like, this is anecdotal, like there's the fact that I've been to so many different countries, the fact that I've met so many different people in so many different areas, and yet I have somehow always managed to find at least someone neurodivergent to hang with, even by accident. That kind of shows that they are common enough that you don't need to really look that hard to find them, unless I've just been incredibly lucky. So they are out there, and you know, I think the statistics back that up. So the long story short, ADHD and autistic people fuck, and they're really good at fucking. And so what's happening here? What's happening with autism, ADHD? What the hell kind of advantages is it giving that they've been allowed to develop a pretty healthy population size? You know, a pretty healthy population. What's going on here? What's happening? Well, like I said, I'm not really a scientist. I am just someone who has lived with these conditions, rather, most of my life. And thus, it is to my benefit to try and understand it, try to, develop as firm an understanding as I can. And I'm always learning new stuff every day, and assumptions that I had before, they continue to be challenged and evolved, and I gain new context. But as it stands right now, my understanding is, what's the way to describe it? I have it written here. I just have to find it. I just have to find it. I need to zoom into my notes a tiny bit. This is what happens when I go off script. I have trouble figuring out where the relevant part of the of my notes are. Okay, yep. So the analogy I've heard to describe this is that ADHD and autism, I think both of these, they only became a disorder when larger human society embraced a certain way of life. So there are back, in hunter-gatherer times, and even back at the dawn of the, during the agricultural revolution, stuff like that. Back thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, from hunter-gatherer through the agricultural revolution, there were multiple different kinds of human life of lifestyles that were kind of equally dispersed throughout the planet, and some people within the same tribe would kind of live different lifestyles and have different strengths and weaknesses to help that tribe thrive. And the way I heard Dr. K describe it is this is a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it kind of helps to illustrate what might be going on here. Is that we had two kinds of people all the way back when. We had farmers and we had hunters. So you got farmers who would follow basically the same patterns every day. They would rise and fall with the sun. They would go through, the same routine. And, they were, getting up at the butt crack of dawn, doing these very, monotonous tasks, sowing the seeds, reaping the harvest, nurturing things. They were very good at delayed gratification. They were very patient people. And their genetics lined up with that lifestyle. And that's what made them very, very successful. Meanwhile, you got hunters who they ebbed and flowed. They were the problem solvers of the prehistoric world. They didn't stick with a singular routine per se. I mean, they would have their own rituals, most likely. They would have a certain way of doing things, but they were constantly adapting and learning and assessing situations. They would hyperfixate on these situations so they could learn to hunt their prey better. They would live very much in the moment rather than looking ahead. I imagine there's probably there's probably a degree of delayed gratification, right? Like you got to learn how to look at tracks and stuff to look for signs that an animal has been in the area. But it was always every day was a new challenge for hunters, and that's kind of probably where the ADHD people originate from. Is that these people who hyperfixated on different problems and were able to just change their focus on a whim and kind of had to do it for the sake of their survival. And there would be the people who would go out, they would hunt. They would not live this ultra domesticated lifestyle. As a result of this, they needed a much higher level of stimulation than farmers, most likely, because everything is changing all the time. So they need to be able to keep track of that. And so I think the takeaway there is that the farmers and the hunters, they both had their place. They were both contributing. They were both very successful in what they did, but they were also very fundamentally different, and different kinds of people would be suited to the farmer or hunter lifestyle. However, the farmers ultimately won, right? I think that's just because farmers, they were a lot more reliable, most likely. They were, when you have that consistent routine, that consistent output. This is me speculating at the moment, just so we're clear. I'm interested to hear your guys' feedback, and I imagine this is going to be an interesting or an engrossing ongoing study. Is what are the origins of ADHD? What were the genetic advantages? What are the different layers that go with that? But I think if I were to speculate based on the limited information that I know, the farmers won out just because they were more consistent, and so society became more and more reliant on the farmers, which is probably, I think that's a good thing. Reliability ultimately is good, but that meant that people whose brains were more tuned to be hunters, more tuned to problem solve. They became, I suppose, more niche. They were suddenly being put into situations that, farmer brains, they're great. They're fine. They're fine with low levels of stimulation, low levels of X, Y, and Z. Hunter brains, no. They need to be out there. They need to be doing things. They need to be solving things. They need to be, chasing the dopamine so that they can chase the prey, sort of thing. And it just wasn't happening. So as a result, slowly but surely, ADHD became a disorder. Probably, at least in part because people whose genetics had fine-tuned, had made their brains biased to being wired towards a certain way, simply weren't getting accommodated for as human civilization continued to show a bias towards a certain way of existing. Which is why I think we're in a good spot right now, because we're starting to finally realize the complexities of ADHD, and we're starting to realize where the true strengths of ADHD lie. And it's far from perfect, very far from perfect, but we're starting to actually have those conversations that, for thousands of years we probably weren't, which I think is a very good thing. Again, very simple. This is very ultra simplified. This is me going off what I've heard, kind of me thinking about how, it might be that, and look, the way genetics and evolution works, the hunters of yore and the farmers of yore probably don't have the same brains as the people that exist right now. We are kind of we are descended from those people, but I think a lot of that genetic material still passed on, and so we are kind of variants of those initial archetypes. I think that's entirely possible. It's just it's something to think about at the very least. Let's see. I have to step out. Yep, that's all good. I'm intoxicated, so I forget how we got to farmers. I don't think the farmers were the ones that won. It's a mix of... Oh, yeah, it's not... I don't think that, when I say win, I mean that our human civilization got more structured around, the root... is more similar to the routines of farmers of old, rather than the more chaotic lifestyles of the hunters of yore, right? That's kind of what I mean. But, of course, there's a melting pot there. There are many different dimensions to it. It's more that society is structured around monotony to an extent, a monotony that the hunter brain just can't deal with. So that's kind of more the thing I'm going for. So the D in ADHD might be inaccurate. I think it's not inaccurate. It's just more complex than just being a disorder. It's why sometimes I prefer to call it a condition if I'm in the right sort of environment. I guess I refer to it as a disorder when it is a disorder to me. So, and I kind of I try to call it a condition at other points. It's so deeply complex. Oh yeah, and hunters did have routines. I'm more just saying that they're both very different. One is definitely much more improvisey, problem solvey, high stimuli sort of thing, while the other one is definitely more, like you said, low risk, high reward sort of thing. So yeah, just take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. I would say I'm more well informed than a lot of people on the subject, but that doesn't mean, in terms of ADHD, that is not necessarily history. But that doesn't mean I know everything. It doesn't mean that I'm infallible. It doesn't mean that you should be taking my word as gospel. It's more just listen to what I say, and then go to channels like How to ADHD or Healthy Gamer GG, and see if I'm misinterpreting anything, see if I'm doing things, read actual studies from actual scientists if you're so inclined, read articles from reliable sources. I'm here to be a gateway to the subject more than the arbiter, which I am happy to do. So this kind of leads to the next thing. Now, this is a question that was asked more directly, and I just completely missed it. I think Swalpool asked it, which was, what is executive dysfunction? Now, last stream I was talking about, when I was talking about ADHD, I kind of just mentioned this as a throwaway because I forgot that a lot of people might not know what it means. So I said that X, Y, and Z is, because of my executive dysfunction. And I think a lot of people, or at least Swalpool did. I imagine there were more people than just him, but they were wondering, what is executive dysfunction? Well, I think the easiest way to talk about executive dysfunction is to talk about what our executive functions are. So I'll just get up this chart because I like charts. They're neat. I think they're neat. I'm gonna move it out of the way of chat. Tiny bit smaller. There we go. I think they're neat. So we got executive functions. So these are all the things executive functions cover. You've got flexible thinking, the ability to adjust behavior to unexpected changes, working memory, keep key information in mind while using it, self-monitoring, so self-awareness to how one is doing in the moment, planning, prioritizing, to set and meet goals, task initiation, take action to get started on a task, organization, keep track of things physically and mentally, impulse control, thinking before acting, emotional control, keep feelings in check. And flexible think. I already said flexible thinking. So a very simple way to describe it is that it is the part of the brain that is responsible for planning goals and planning, initiating, and accomplishing goals. Like, that is the very broad strokes way to describe it. That's a very clinical way of describing it. But sometimes just describing something clinically doesn't quite sum up what it means, especially when I'm talking about a condition that affects this function within the brain. I like to use metaphors, because metaphors help to communicate ideas a lot better than just very clinical information. Because clinical information is often, it's great if you already are kind of in the know on a subject, and then if you're not, it becomes very frustrating. It can become very deeply frustrating. I'm wondering if a showdown is about to happen between these two cats. I don't think so. They haven't really been fighting. They'll get into like a little they'll get into a little slap fight, and then they'll usually stop. I think it's going to be fine. Okay, yeah, she's just going up to sniff her. And she's sleeping. Very good. So good. So nice to your sister. Good girl. Good girl. Okay, that was our cat break for the day. So the way I like to look at, oh God, how did this happen? We're smarter than this. Oh no, redo. Okay, there we go. So the metaphor I like to use is that everyone has a little executive that lives in their prefrontal cortex. Just imagine like it's a tiny little man or a woman who, it's a boss. It's the boss that lives in your brain, and and it lives in your prefrontal cortex. And for neurotypical people, it will regulate. It'll regulate you. It'll engage with like the self-monitoring, the emotional control, all of that. It'll bring all of that together to help you be functional in life, to regulate you. Executive dysfunction is basically when that same boss, when the boss in your brain starts getting drunk and stoned all the time, and the team he's meant to oversee, the self-monitoring, the planning and prioritizing. Let's imagine all of these little guys. They're like team members, and the executive function is supposed to keep them all in line. Imagine the boss is getting drunk and stoned all the time, and so the team is left without leadership to coordinate them. And thus, task initiation's not really happening. Planning and prioritizing is all over the place. Emotions are really high and very volatile and flary. Like, it varies from person to person. But the point is, like, that's kind of what executive dysfunction means. It means that the little man that lives in your prefrontal cortex, metaphorically speaking, is getting drunk and stoned all the time. And thus, all the things that are meant to just automatically happen kind of don't automatically happen. Feel like I've been called out, lol. I'm hot-headed and very quick to rage when I'm sober, but chill when I'm drinking. What does that make me? That could be a lot of things. I am no psychiatrist, sir. That is definitely goes beyond the scope of this video, of this stream, of this podcast. We give out, we talk about issues. We don't give out diagnoses. And that's the job for trained professionals who, even then, they don't always get it right. And that's why it's, if you're feeling a bit shifty, it's always good to get like a second opinion from a few different sources. But don't shop around for a diagnosis at the same time. Don't shop around if you think you have something and then like multiple people say no. Don't try to shop around for it, because the chances are it might be something else. Playing the numbers game with that it's complicated. I will not give any concrete advice. I will only advise for or against certain things. So, with that said, the problems with executive functions aren't insurmountable, and in what ways the executive functions are affected varies from ADHD person to ADHD person. ADHD is a spectrum. Some people cope better than others, and even a single individual's ability to cope varies. Jessica McCabe from How to ADHD uses the term having a bad brain day, or having a bad brain week, or something like that. I think that was used early. I think other people were using that before her, maybe. Not entirely sure. All I know is that the first time I heard like the term having a bad brain day was from her, and I just found that phrase just instantly relatable. So I just wanted to give credit where it was due. And it's like, oh my God, you're right. Like sometimes, I want that in the wider collective nomenclature, because sometimes, like, the simplest way to describe like how ADHD affects you is that sometimes you just have a bad brain day. You have one of those days where the executive functions just aren't doing what they're meant to be doing, and you can have just these bad brain periods where that think organ isn't cooperating in the way that we need it to. And it would be nice if we could be more open about that. I think if we can just say, oh, sorry, I'm having a bad brain day, bad brain week, and then someone would, there would be a level of understanding and compassion for that, rather than going like, oh, you're making excuses, you're lazy, la 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 la, all this very dismissive shit that often results in people not actually, it can be very damaging. Needless to say, I went a lot into that last week about how ADHD symptoms are often confused for bad behavior, and it's something I think people should be more cautious about. And then there was some interesting conversations in chat going on about the distinction between bad behavior and ADHD symptoms. And it's not entirely black and white, but the point is there is no amount of applying yourself that's going to help the symptoms. You kind of have to attack those, and then you start to see improvement, whether that's through psychotherapy, whether that's through meds, or look, the secret about ADHD is that there is no one treatment that's going to do everything. You kind of need to slowly, you kind of have to mold your lifestyle around it. And that's kind of when you start hitting the good times. I know I've had many a bad brain day over the last few months, and I imagine they'll keep cropping up. And I want to use this podcast to be open and honest whenever it does happen, and even explore the why for how these things happen. I'm going to talk more about my own executive dysfunction and how that affects me in a little while. But I hope this little discussion about executive dysfunction has helped to just kind of clarify our terms a little bit, help to define things just a tiny bit. And I'm probably going to continue to add clarification to it over time, because I don't always because I think I wrote these notes when I was having a bit of a bad brain day, to tell you the truth. So they're not quite as going in and out of everything as I would like, but I think it works as kind of just a rough summary. Erective dysfunction. Oh man. Well, as an engineer, I am fascinated by the origin of conditions, but I am more inclined towards the practical, which is why I tried to establish routine to help foster the executive. Exactly, routine is very important. I think routine is extremely important. I think there is no one way to deal with this stuff. You do have to look at it. It's almost like symptom by symptom, and we're still learning more and more about how to medicate ADHD people. Like, we've come so far with that. Like, this is something I'm considering, right? And I want to point out, when I say I'm considering it, that doesn't mean I'm recommending it, because I don't even know if it's going to work. I'm just saying that I'm thinking about it. So don't take this as advice. Take this as this is what I'm thinking about at the moment. I always have to really give like 50 disclaimers whenever it's anything even remotely medical, because then people might go off the walls with it and do some really damaging stuff. I got a responsibility of care to you guys. I need to make sure no one takes my advice as gospel. So there was a recent paper that came out that stated that it might actually be more effective for someone with ADHD to be on 2 ADHD medications at once, rather than so there are 2 options, right? You're either on a stimulant medication or you're on a non-stimulant medication, and both of them do different things to the brain in different ways. As it turns out, if you're being on both a stimulant and a non-stimulant medication, might actually get better results. I think there's been a couple of studies showing that at this point. So I was talking to, I think, my psychologist about it. She can't prescribe me anything. That's a different person. But I was just talking about it because we were talking about different things. And she said something that would be good to do would be to actually print out or bring in the study, and just show my GP, look, I've been looking at this. I'm thinking that maybe this will help my symptoms a bit better. I obviously am not as well informed as like a psychiatrist, but I would at least like the option to explore this. So I think that's something I'm mulling over in my head at the moment. I think I'm probably going to go through with it. I just got to clear up some well, if we're talking about executive dysfunction, it applies to very small things like booking doctor's appointments and stuff. So I'm waiting until my brain clears up a tiny bit, which it's due to very soon, thanks to some certain events that are about to happen. But I'll get into that later. Yeah, very, very interesting stuff. Let's see. You need a organoiatrist. 1 out of 3 memes recommend chewing gum. I mentioned that theory before on chat. I think there can be an ebb and flow balance that can be achieved because the cortex has a limited capacity. The best way may be to borrow and retrieve it. Yeah, that's the thing. It's all about developing healthy adaptive strategies, right? I think self-awareness, for starters. Like, if you're going to put your points into anything, self-awareness is going to get you a long way. It's not going to get you all the way. Obviously, there's a lot of other stuff, but just being aware of when your symptoms are flaring up and how it's affecting you, like practicing mindfulness, that is hugely helpful. Like, when I'm having like a big anxiety episode, I'm kind of able, like, thanks to my mindfulness practice, I'm able to kind of I'm not able to, just stop myself from feeling anxious on the spot, but I am able to, like, remove my thinky brain from my emotional brain. And my thinky brain is able to look at my emotional brain and see why my emotional brain is reacting that way. And is that going to stop me from being anxious? No, but I'm able to see the anxiety for what it is rather than having it be the thing that determines what my thinky brain does. So, anecdotal there. I have a friend who was diagnosed with some form of autism and the medicine that altered brain chemistry. Well, that's the thing about medication, right? Is that it's not a silver bullet. It's a tool. And if the medication is making you worse, that probably means it's either the wrong medication or it's the wrong dose. That's my understanding of it, is that most of the time, if medication is doing X, Y, or Z, like if a medication is doing some funky things, that probably means it's the wrong medication for you, because every single brain is going to be affected differently. And you got to some people have to cycle through a few medications before they find something that works. So they have to cycle through dosages, which is actually, with stimulant medication, that's actually a lot easier to do, because with stimulant medication, antidepressants are complicated because you have to wait weeks and weeks and weeks for it to build up in your system for it to start having an effect. Stimulant medication is different. Anyone who's had coffee knows what stimulant medication does, only to a lesser degree. So pretty immediately if the stimulant medication is working. Like the first time I took my drugs, right? I was in a shopping center and it was like seeing color for the first time. It was like putting on eyeglasses. Like I've heard both metaphors used because a lot of people have this experience when they go on meds for the first time and it happens to be the right meds. And it was funny. It was like a fog had lifted and suddenly I could focus on what I wanted to focus on. There was a sense of calm and peace inside me that just hadn't existed before up until that point. I just felt in control. I felt very in control. So what did I do with that control? I went around and I read signs because I was able to read things without having to struggle because it wasn't stimulating enough. I just went around that shopping mall for 2 hours because I had 2 hours to kill before the movie. And I just looked at signs. I just looked at things. That didn't mean my ADHD was cured, but it meant that suddenly my prefrontal cortex was a lot more stimulated. Now, the thing I've discovered since then is that what really helped the medication to work was the fact that I was in very good physical shape. I was in very good, I was in a great sort of place as far as my physique was concerned, as far as my lifestyle. And so that shows that the ADHD medication, it isn't a silver bullet. I'm going to get into that in a little bit, but it's not a silver bullet. It's one tool in the belt to help treat the condition and to help compensate. You looked at signs. Did you find Jesus? Maybe. I don't know. It was hiding in like 25% off PlayStation 4s or something. So yeah, when I started on the medication, I felt I was more, I guess I was more aware, because in the same way that you're more aware of your surroundings on a clear day than a foggy day, if that makes sense. So it's like I had all this noise in my head, and that's very common with ADHD, just this constant noise because the brain is trying to stimulate itself, and so it becomes very overwhelming. And it vanished. And suddenly everything just kind of settled. And it's like my brain, it's like you're on the beach and there's a storm raging, there are waves hitting the shoreline. It's just really there's rain coming down, and then the storm stopped, the water came to stillness, and there was just peace, and I could focus on everything. Drugs like cocaine do similar things, I know that, and that's because the stimulant medication. I imagine a lot of people with ADHD accidentally self-medicate with stuff like cocaine, because cocaine does do similar things, but the problem is they're not doing it under the supervision of a medical practitioner. They're not getting guidance for it from a healthcare professional. It's just snorting a line is not a good way to determine things. And what happens when they start snorting it? They want to snort more and more and more, and they develop a huge tolerance for it. While if you have a medical practitioner guiding you, setting rules for how the medication should be used, you're in a much better place. Oh yeah, you can shove it up your ass. Yeah, to be sure. So yeah, that's my medication story there. I guess it was it changed my life in a lot of ways, but it's not going to change everybody's life immediately. And sometimes you do have to go through a few different meds. I got lucky. I got it right on the first try, and maybe I'll need to bump up my dose eventually. I try to avoid that just in case there are, just in case. The things I worry about is having to bump up my dose and then that being like a cycle. I would rather absolutely determine that I would need to bump up my dose than to do it. Than to do it just because it's never going to be as effective as it is in the first 2 weeks. And it is going to depend a lot on lifestyle for its effectiveness. But that doesn't mean it's not doing anything. It just means that it's one factor. Gasoline is not going to go anywhere without the car being maintained, right? The car's not going to function, or rather, like the oil. The oil in the car is not going to help your car move without the gas to drive it. I guess is a good metaphor. So someone last stream, I was going through like all the different ways ADHD affects me and how it can affect other people as well. Let's see. Can you drive a car with oil only, so you don't need gasoline at all? Like, you can just have a completely empty tank, no reserve, and you can just go with like, the car's oil? I didn't know that. Okay. Got to double check that later, but I'll take your word for it for now. Let's see. Probably not far up. Yeah, I don't know cars. Let's assume that we live in a world where gasoline you need gas in the tank, 100%. I think we all get the general gist of that metaphor. Even if there are with every metaphor, you can always find exceptions. Like we're talking, when we use the metaphor, it's more, sometimes you have to just look in between the lines a little bit. So someone asked, last stream, like I was saying, how do you keep a steady job with ADHD? And the answer, it's very difficult to do. And I've never been able to maintain a full-time position. I've not even maintained a part-time position, really. Where do I exist in the workforce? I exist in the casual and freelance space because I rely pretty heavily on like disability payments and subsidies, because my brain, like I present very well, but my executive functions, I can't really function in like a traditional workspace. And believe me, I've had tastes of it over the years. I used to be part of a modeling agency, and what they would do is they would of course have like the photography, modeling jobs, and occasional acting work and stuff. But they would also offer promotional modeling jobs, which is a very glorified way of saying very temporary, casual retail work. And yeah, I couldn't stand it, to tell you the truth. Especially on jobs where you're not even allowed to check the time, because the only way I could check the time was on my phone. And yeah, there was a lot of things that were like meant to be intuitive, but they just weren't. And yeah, I just didn't have a way of stimulating myself properly. So I just, I enjoyed the money I made on those jobs, but I don't think I could ever do those jobs like in the long term. So that's why I kind of exist in this space. But that's different for everyone, right? There are some people with ADHD who absolutely can maintain these positions. They absolutely, and I think, and look, if it was a job I really loved, I could maintain it. It's just like, stuff that if there's a job that, a regular person would find monotonous, I would find it torturous, if that makes sense. Like, I described last stream ADHD one of the many facets of it is it's like being clinically bored. It's where, something that's boring to a regular person is kind of like, someone to an ADHD person, it is actual painful torture. I still haven't looked up if it actually triggers the pain receptors, but it certainly feels like it. So how do you keep focus during editing and writing? Well, that's the thing. ADHD doesn't mean no focus. It means a lack of focus regulation. So that sometimes means that you just can't focus on one thing. Sometimes it means going ding, 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 ding with your focus. You just can't focus on anything. But other times it means you hyper focus. It means that all you can focus on is this one thing. And that's how I get writing and editing done. I hyper focus. But what are the consequences of that? Shouldn't that, that's a superpower and a weakness rolled into one, hyper focus? Because when I say I'm not able to focus on anything else, I mean, I don't eat. I barely imbibe fluids. I don't stand up most of the time. I don't do anything else but write and edit. And that's how I get that stuff done. And I don't really have much control over when that happens. Sometimes I have to, sit with the discomfort of the initial monotony before I get into a hyper focus flow. And once that happens, it's both really good and really bad at the same time. Because again, I can be once I enter hyper focus, this is the paradox of ADHD. I am both less productive than most people, and I can get more work done than most regular people. I can get more work done in a night than most people get done in a week. But that comes at a price. It's a very difficult thing. And, an example of hyperfocus in a non-work environment is video games. It's very easy to hyperfixate on video games because those actively give a dopamine reward most of the time. Someone with a video game, it might take a couple of tries to get into it, but when you get sunk into it, you just can't do anything else. You can't think about anything else than playing that video game. Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. It's one of the many complexities of ADHD because people tend to think that it is just, you can't focus or you are jumping off the walls. And it can be that, but it's part of a much larger thing. The reason stimulant medication works so well is because the hyperactivity part of ADHD, that the hyperactivity comes from just the brain wants to keep stimulating itself. So being hyper is creating stimulation. So when you introduce a stimulant that is providing that stimulation that the hyperactivity was, suddenly the hyperactivity stops. That's where the calm comes from. You no longer have this buzzing happening inside of you, and you're just able to go, okay, I'm just able to achieve stillness. I'm able to just be. And, that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Interesting. I never really thought about ADHD that much, but the way you describe it sounds very interesting. I'm very glad. I'm very happy that I'm making it interesting. I really am, and I really appreciate that feedback because I want to make it interesting. Not just because I'm interested in it, academically speaking, but also just I think the more we understand it, the more we can help people with ADHD because it is a very misunderstood disorder. And I think the key to that is making it interesting. I think not making it just this very clinical thing. Which is why I recommend channels like How to ADHD and Healthy Gamer GG, because they make it very accessible and they also make it quite interesting, and both in their own different ways. My conclusion from this stream is that I have ADHD. Oh, maybe it's pretty common. It's pretty common. It's probably pretty common. Honestly, Spook, with the quality of your work and the sheer time and dedication that you put into your work, I could believe it. I could definitely believe it. Yeah, that's the thing. And here's the funny thing, right? So we have a lot of kids nowadays who are getting diagnosed with ADHD, which I think is great. I think my therapist, who's she's trained she specializes in autism and ADHD, so she's in the know about this stuff. Overdiagnosis of ADHD was more common in the early 2000s and stuff apparently, and now as time has gone on, overdiagnosis is starting to curve a little bit and people are actually getting diagnosed. So I think the fact that we're getting a lot more diagnoses that are accurate nowadays, apparently, don't there might be someone else thinking, oh no, this is wrong. That's just what I've heard. I think that's a very good thing. What it also means is that a lot of kids are getting diagnosed, and then their parents are confused about the diagnosis because they're hearing the symptoms and they're like, are you sure he's got a diagnosis? Because this is how I work. And then they start thinking about it and they go, fuck, do I have ADHD? So a lot of diagnoses nowadays are not just like kids getting diagnosed because we're now better at diagnosing it than we used to be. Obviously, still probably have a long way to go. We still have to work on those waiting lists for psychiatrists that specialize in it, for example. But we're getting there. We're making progress. But now, we're also just getting this influx of parents getting the diagnosis because their kids are getting diagnosed. And guess what, guys? If you have got ADHD, chances are one of your parents did. One of your parents probably didn't know they had it. They probably just thought the amount of strain they were going through with basic things was just a normal thing. And then they suddenly realized, this is not normal. I have been living a lie, or I've been living under false assumptions. I just find that really, really interesting. It is, I think that's the same thing with autism as well. Like, I think if your kid gets diagnosed with something, it starts making you question where the genetic material for that came from. Unless they're adopted, of course, then probably not asking the same questions. Let's see. So this is an interesting thing that came up thanks to Swalpool, which was like, can exercise be used to treat ADHD? Which I think, which the answer was yes. But something I realized was that an implication of that might be that, you can just use exercise to treat ADHD. You can use exercise as a replacement for medication. So can you use exercise as a replacement for medication? And I want to kind of explore that a little bit because I don't think I don't think there's a definitive yes or no for this. I think it's more the answer lies somewhere in the middle. So the answer is both yes and no. So no matter what, exercise is always going to improve the symptoms of ADHD. But this is under the assumption that a routine is maintained, right? So much in the same way that a medication is only going to be effective if you take it every day around the same time, or at least every day. Try to take it around the same time though, because your body is because then the amount of the medication in your system is going to start to fluctuate. So I think that's something doctors need to tell people more. You need to take it around the same time every day in order to get optimal results. I think that's something people struggle with. So the issue with exercise as a solo treatment plan is just it's the question of how well someone is able to maintain that routine and for how long. Exercise can become quite monotonous, even on medication, and it's very easy to prioritize other activities over it. So the medication can at least ensure a greater level of consistency. Because you know how many times I've had my coffee just before the gym, and then I'm in this I got all my brain chemicals are lining up, and then I'm just like, zoom. Instead of going to the gym, I think I can get 3 paragraphs out for this thing. Then I go to write all the things, and then I don't end up going to the gym. It is a difficult thing to maintain it over the long term. And so I think you need to do it in conjunction with medication, because medication is going to help you maintain a level of consistency that that exercise isn't going to. A lot of people with ADHD are already self-medicating before the gym, whether they know it or not. Let's not mince words here. Caffeine is a stimulant, and because it's a stimulant, it actually does help ADHD. Not as effectively as a drug designed for ADHD, but it will have similar, if less noticeable effects. So if you switch to a stimulant medication that is specifically designed to treat the disorder, it's only going to help in keeping an exercise routine. So both kind of feed into the other. But of course, if you don't take the medication, the exercise is going to still do something. It is still going to be it's going to do a few things. It's going to provide all those neurotransmitters that ADHD people crave, and it's also going to help in other ways. So in my experience, when you are physically stronger, when your muscles are being worked out, when you are maintaining a certain level of physical fitness, you get things like your posture improve. Now, why is that important for ADHD? Well, bad posture leads to chronic pain, right? Because something that's bad. I've been doing some back exercises the last few days because I've had a lot of my muscle tone in my back had disappeared because I've been a bit sedentary the last year. So as a result, and I sit down at the computer a lot, so my chest muscles were tightening up. My back muscles didn't have enough strength to pull my shoulder blades back. And so I was getting a lot of I've been getting a lot of chronic upper back pain, and I've been getting a stiff neck, and so that's been a distraction. Like any chronic pain, anything that can be a distraction will only make the condition worse. Because you're kind of starting at a because if you're getting stimulated in the wrong way, that's going to be detrimental. Like you have shoulders. Bah, you're right. You're right. Yeah, I only started drinking coffee again, like after I'd been on the medication for like a year. And the medication had settled. I refused to have caffeine for like the first year. And then I had a little bit and I was fine. So I figured out that's not the best way to do it. I don't recommend doing it that way. That was just me being, ADHD. Just like not wanting to go through the extra step of asking the doctor. I just did the thing, but I don't recommend it. That's not a medical recommendation. Don't get stimulated the wrong way. Yep. Do not get. So yeah, that's, I'm getting hot. One second. I'm going to take off my jumper. The good thing about the music I have playing is it's not just like a nice ambience. It's also just a nice bit of white noise for me. It kind of acts as white noise for me where, that's another thing I think that helps ADHD people, at least some of them, is some degree of white noise, something in the background playing to kind of counteract the noise that naturally occurs in our heads. It's, there are so many facets to it. Like I could go on for hours and still not even, like sometimes I don't even feel like I'm scratching the surface of the intricacies of it. Well, you can keep going, Spook. I'm not stopping you. In fact, I expected it. Thinky think organ tingles with magic metal waves. Exactly. That's something I got into I need to get back into is binaural beats, because I actually find them to be quite helpful. Like, I thought it was going to be, like, pseudoscience, but then I looked it up, and it turns out there is actually a scientific basis for binaural beats. I don't think every binaural beats channel is legit, necessarily, but I think when it's, like, focusing on something like serotonin production or focus, it does something for my brain that feels chemical rather than placebo, but then again, maybe it is a placebo. I don't know. The point is, I want to look more into binaural beats as kind of a way to continue to further refine how I engage with my brain. So got a little tweety mapoo here. This is like if you look into it, won't that make you believe it more? Well, that's complicated, right? Because that depends on I think I'll only believe in it more if the science is coming up as it working. I mean, placebos kind of work either way if you initially believed it, but I'm only more likely to believe it more if the science continues to line up with it. I think that's how that works anyway. I use the Enterprise noise hums. I love the Enterprise noise hums, honestly. I think I fall asleep when I hear them. It's so soothing. I would love living on that ship if that's just the constant ambience. It feels like it would be nice for my brain. Just a little bit of white noise it's a beautiful thing. It's a very beautiful thing.